Opening hook. The unasked beginning. Did you ever agree to be alive? Did anyone hand you a choice, a contract, or even a warning before pulling you into this world? Of course not. And yet here you are, breathing, thinking, enduring. From the very first moment, before you could even form words, you were marked by a scream. That first cry wasn't joy. It was pain, the human initiation rite, the shock of cold air rushing into fragile lungs, the severing of the umbilical tether, the skin burning with sudden exposure. We call it a new life. Perhaps it is more honest to call it the first wound. We like to romanticize birth as a miracle, but the truth is far darker and far simpler. You never asked for this. No infant consents to becoming a participant in the lifelong experiment called existence. And yet, every birth is precisely that, a gamble in which someone else places a bet using your life as the stake. For centuries, mothers and fathers have celebrated this act as sacred, as though bringing new life were an unquestionable good. And yet behind the balloons, celebrations, and smiling photos, one unsettling fact looms. With every new life we create, we also create a new subject of suffering, a new body destined to feel heartbreak, loneliness, illness, and eventually death. We call life a gift, but how many gifts are wrapped in inevitable loss? What if birth itself carries cruelty at its very core? Not simply as an accident of circumstance, not simply because the world is harsh, but because to create life at all is to impose suffering where there was once none. This first contradiction, this quiet horror presented as blessing, is where our journey begins. Life, a miracle on the surface, a sentence underneath. And the question that lingers, like an echo with no comforting reply, is this: is existence the greatest gift or the first and deepest curse ever passed down? The ancient unease, philosophical roots of antinatalism. Long before modern philosophy, long before psychology or even medicine, human beings already sensed something unsettling about being alive. The question of existence, whether it is a blessing or a burden, has haunted civilizations like a shadow that never leaves. The ancient Greeks, masters of tragedy, understood this well. In the timeless voice of Sophocles, we hear the lament, "Never to be born is best." To him, and to many others, existence was not a prize to be envied, but a fate to be endured. What kind of gift could leave even the wisest voices concluding that absence is preferable to presence? The same intuition arises in the East. The Buddha's first noble truth declares the nature of life as dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, perpetual unrest. Birth is not the beginning of joy. It is the opening of a wound, one that never fully heals. In Buddhist thought, life is not inherently cruel because of society or because of bad luck, but because craving and impermanence are built into existence itself. To be alive is by design to hurt. Elsewhere, in the strange mysticism of the Gnostics, creation itself was seen as a trap, not a triumph. The material world, with its pains and flaws, was believed to be the handiwork of a lesser, even malevolent deity. To be born was not to be blessed by God, but imprisoned in the flesh, bound to suffering, and chained to the slow erosion of time. Across continents and centuries, across cultures that never touched in life, yet converged in thought, the verdict repeats. Something about existence feels wrong. Something about the act of being thrust into the world seems less like grace and more like betrayal. These ancient voices remind us that antinatalism is not a product of modern cynicism, nor the invention of some isolated philosopher. It is an old undercurrent in the river of human thought, appearing again and again in myth, religion, and tragedy. It whispers from the fragments of ruined temples, from the mantras chanted in silent monasteries, from parables buried in forgotten texts. And centuries later, when Schopenhauer carved his philosophy of life as suffering into Western thought, he was not creating a doctrine from nothing. He was inheriting an unease as old as humanity itself, giving structure and language to what ancient stories had always proclaimed. Perhaps it is not calamity or misfortune that makes life cruel. Perhaps life itself is the calamity. Schopenhauer's shadow, the philosophy of suffering. Enter Arthur Schopenhauer, a man often remembered not for his optimism, but for his relentless refusal to look away from the bleakness of human life. If Hegel and others of his time sought to elevate history and reason as triumphs, Schopenhauer stared into the abyss and insisted on telling us exactly what he saw. He became, in effect, the great systematizer of pessimism, the philosopher willing to declare, without hesitation, that suffering is not merely part of life, but its very foundation. At the heart of Schopenhauer's thought lies the concept of the will to live. For him, existence is not governed by reason or harmony, but by a blind, insatiable force that compels every creature to continue striving, reproducing, consuming. This will has no higher purpose, no divine justification. It simply demands that life persists, ruthlessly, endlessly, without regard for the pain it causes. To live under this rule, Schopenhauer argued, is to be trapped in a cycle of desire. We want, we strive, we believe that fulfilling a desire will bring satisfaction. And perhaps it does, for a fleeting moment. But almost immediately, another desire rises up in its place. Hunger returns. Ambitions grow. Love fades, then turns to longing again. The reward for our satisfaction is not contentment, but the certainty of more craving. Pleasure, in Schopenhauer's piercing view, is not even a real positive state. It is merely the temporary lull between pains, the absence of suffering for a brief while. Like catching your breath after nearly drowning, relief feels good, but only because the torment of suffocation stopped for a moment. Thus, struggle and suffering are fundamental. Happiness is only the rare shadow they cast. And here we arrive at Schopenhauer's most radical and most disturbing application of his philosophy, procreation. To bring a new child into the world, he wrote, is to drag another being into the inexorable machinery of suffering. The newborn did not ask for life. It did not vote yes to pain, disappointment, illness, or the slow approach of death. Parents may summon a child out of love, desire, or even pride, but for the child itself, this act is indistinguishable from cruelty. Birth is the sentencing of an innocent to a lifetime of burdens they never chose to bear. In Schopenhauer's world, the so-called miracle of life becomes far darker. It is the reproduction of tragedy on a mass scale, generation after generation. We disguise it with warmth, hope, and celebration, but beneath those layers lies an inescapable core, the certainty of suffering. This is why Schopenhauer's presence still feels spectral, even today. He walks behind us whenever we begin to question the cheery platitudes society repeats about joy and life's purpose. His philosophy, like a ghostly whisper, reminds us of the cost we usually refuse to acknowledge, that every act of creation entails an act of imposition, that behind every smiling family photo stands an invisible ledger of illness, heartbreak, and mortality yet to come. Other philosophers sought to find beauty in destiny, freedom in struggle, or meaning in grand narratives. Schopenhauer cut deeper. He urged us to abandon illusion and recognize an uncomfortable truth. Suffering is not an accident we occasionally endure. It is the essence of life itself. And once you accept that, the act of creating new life cannot be celebrated without irony. It becomes something sinister, an expansion of suffering disguised as an act of love. In this shadow lies both his brilliance and his burden. Schopenhauer held up a mirror, forcing us to see what most would rather not. That in choosing to create, we may simply be multiplying torment. And that raises the chilling question, is existence itself a kindness or a cruelty we have dressed in euphemisms to bear it more easily? The psychology of procreation, why we reproduce anyway. If existence is woven with suffering, if every birth is in some sense a sentence, then why do we keep doing it? Why, generation after generation, do humans continue to create life as though the lessons of pain have failed to leave their mark? The first answer is brutal in its simplicity: biology. Beneath all our art, philosophy, and lofty aspirations lies the most primitive command of nature: survive and reproduce. Our bodies are wired for it. Our minds flooded with chemical rewards to ensure it. The dopamine rush of attraction, the intoxication of desire, the bliss of intimacy, all of these are incentives carefully engineered by evolution to override hesitation. Pleasure is not a gift in itself, but bait in nature's trap, urging us to create more lives that will, in turn, face the same cycle of longing and pain. Then comes the undeniable pull of parental instinct. Once a child exists, something fierce awakens in mothers and fathers. The protective drive, the primal compulsion to endure hardship for the sake of another. This deep commitment to nurture, while beautiful in its devotion, also guarantees that most will forever interpret the act of procreation through the language of love instead of cruelty. Biology makes sure its project is safe by loading parenthood with the heaviest emotional bonds imaginable. But biology alone does not explain it. The continuation of procreation is not just coded into our cells. It is written into our civilizations. Cultures glorify family as destiny. Religions sanctify childbirth as a divine mission. Governments build policies to encourage it. More citizens, more workers, more soldiers, more stability. And on the personal level, to remain childless is still often seen as suspect, if not selfish. Social programming intertwines with biology until the entire machinery of life urges us toward the cradle. And within that machinery lies something subtler, the promise of legacy. People long to see themselves extended beyond their bodies, to believe that by raising children they will cheat death in some symbolic way. A child, they are told, is a living vessel of their memory, their work, their identity. The irony, of course, is that this attempt to secure meaning often functions as a way of outsourcing purpose onto someone who never asked to carry it. Here, then, is the tension that stretches across millennia. Philosophy whispers stop, while biology, culture, and ego shout continue. We know, at least dimly, that life guarantees pain, and yet nature bends us into compliance, making sure the next generation will be born to learn the same truth all over again. In the end, it may not be a rational choice at all. It may be that humanity does not so much decide to reproduce as it is compelled to, the invisible hand not of God or reason, but of evolutionary design, tugging us ever forward into the same repeating cycle. The modern illusions, why society glorifies birth. Step back from the individual mind, and the picture grows even clearer and more unsettling. Birth is not just a private matter between parents and children. It is a structural necessity, the hidden engine that keeps entire societies running. Civilization, for all its talk of morals and meaning, requires one thing above all else: replacement. Nations cannot survive without new citizens. Economies wither if fresh workers do not arrive to sustain the machinery of growth. Militaries need new bodies to train, governments need future taxpayers, and aging populations demand younger generations to shoulder their burden. Without continuous procreation, the foundations of society tremble. And because of this, the act of having children has been glorified, sacralized, and romanticized until it feels beyond question. Religion has long declared family to be sacred law. Multiplying is not just natural, it is holy. Governments, too, quietly step in, cloaking self-interest and patriotic duty, subsidies, tax breaks, national campaigns reminding you that your future belongs to the children you produce. Each smiling advertisement, every slogan promoting family values may appear harmless, yet underneath is a cold calculation. Society's survival depend upon your private choices. It is not only propaganda, but a kind of reframing. Just as war is often presented as honor rather than tragedy, the weight of procreation is cast as joy rather than obligation. To reproduce becomes a symbol of pride. To refuse becomes, in many eyes, a betrayal, not only of family, but of culture itself. Look closely, however, and the cracks show. The same societies that glorify family inevitably produce overcrowding, poverty, and competition for dwindling resources. The same institutions that push for more births often turn their back on the very children created, abandoning them to poor education, crushing debt, collapsing health systems. This is the unspoken paradox. The act of creating life is praised because it sustains the system, not necessarily because it benefits those brought into it. Children are framed as blessings, even when the machinery of society sees them primarily as future laborers, consumers, or soldiers. So the gift of life becomes more than just a parent's emotional comfort. It becomes an orthodoxy, an unquestionable truth reinforced across billboards, pulpits, and policies. Questioning it is almost taboo, because to suggest that birth itself could be ethically suspect is to tug at the loose thread that might unravel an entire social fabric. And so the illusion remains. We think we reproduce to bring joy, meaning, or legacy. But the scaffolding of society whispers another truth, that your decision to create is not purely yours. It has already been shaped, molded, and manipulated to keep the wheels of civilization turning. The weight of existence, the child's burden. The child arrives with a scream. Not laughter, not wonder, but pain. The birth cry is the soundtrack of existence's opening chapter. From that moment forward, the sentence has begun. At first, life disguises itself in moments of tenderness. The comfort of a parent's embrace, the simple pleasures of play, the illusions of safety and innocence. But quickly, almost imperceptibly, the world introduces its lessons. The sting of rejection on the playground. The bewilderment of realizing that promises are not always kept. The anxiety before an exam. The heartbreak of first love. The humiliation of failure. For every fleeting triumph, countless silent disappointments mark the journey. Inevitably, the child becomes an adult, and with adulthood comes the heaviest chapters of the contract. Illness appears not as distant rumor, but as invasive reality. Some watch parents decline, powerless to stop the erosion of those they once depended upon. Others face the sudden destruction of dreams built over decades. Careers collapse, relationships fracture, bodies weaken. And through it all, one fact hovers like a shadow. The story only ends with death. This is not an accident of poor fortune. It is not unlucky individuals who stumble into these burdens. It is the standard package of existence itself. To live is to be vulnerable to heartbreak, to sickness, to betrayal, to loss. And the destination toward which all are marching, naked, helpless, and unwilling, is decay. What deepens the cruelty is that none of this was chosen. No one signed a contract agreeing to injury, grief, or mortality. Yet birth ensures all of it. Once alive, there is no return to the peace of non-existence. The gates have closed forever. You can endure life, you can resist it, you can even attempt to escape it, but you cannot undo the fact that you were thrust into it without your voice or consent. A story is often presented as a treasure, the day you were given life. But if you strip away the celebratory language, it reads more like an irreversible contract forced onto you at the moment of your most helpless state. Every child, however cherished, inherits not only love and opportunities, but also the certain guarantee of suffering, of fear, and of final disappearance. So to create life is, in essence, to force another being into this contract, one they cannot read, cannot refuse, cannot escape. A pledge to endure pain, to carry hope that will often be crushed, to walk toward an unavoidable end. We call it a gift, but confront it honestly, and it begins to look more like a burden disguised in beautiful wrapping. Counterarguments: love, joy, and the defense of birth. To confront the cruelty of birth honestly, we must also allow the defense its voice. For as persuasive as the antinatalist position may feel, life is undeniably more complicated than a ledger of pain. There are moments that burn brightly enough to make people whisper that perhaps existence is worth the cost. There is laughter, deep and uncontrollable, shared in the company of friends. There is love in all its dizzying forms, the love of parent for child, of lovers drawn desperately together, of communities bound by art, ritual, or memory. There are fleeting seconds of transcendence. Seeing the ocean for the first time, hearing music that seems to lift you toward eternity, holding someone's hand, and feeling time itself pause. Many argue that if suffering is guaranteed, then these moments of joy are our redemption. Philosophers, too, have come to life's defense. Nietzsche, in particular, stood among the harshest critics of human illusion, yet still thundered a resounding yes to existence. He insisted that suffering could be transformed into strength, that pain itself could be the forge from which meaning and greatness emerge. For him, to refuse life was cowardice. The task was not to escape, but to affirm, heroically, every agony and every ecstasy alike. But this defense, alluring as it sounds, comes with its cracks. For joy, however luminous, is often precarious. It arises from conditions that disappear quickly. Health, youth, companionship. Pleasure is not eternal, but momentary, always shadowed by its fragility. Even Nietzsche's affirmation demands almost superhuman strength, the will to embrace tragedy without flinching, to dance on the edge of suffering without despair. Can real, ordinary lives, weighed down by financial strain, illness, heartbreak, and daily fatigue, truly live up to such a demand? Or does this heroic ideal merely dismiss the quiet despair of most human existence? Thus, even in its strongest form, the defense of birth does not resolve the paradox. Yes, life contains love, but love exists in a body that will decay. Yes, we find joy, but joy flickers while pain recurs endlessly. The scales of existence never quite balance. And so the question endures, are these moments of beauty enough to justify the certainty of suffering? The ultimate question, should we stop creating life? And so we arrive at the inevitable crossroads, the question that has hovered over every chapter of this exploration. Do we create suffering by creating life? If the answer is yes, then the ethical conclusion can no longer be ignored. Antinatalism presents itself not as nihilism, but as compassion. To stop creating life is to end the chain, to interrupt the inheritance of pain handed down from generation to generation. Here the work of contemporary philosopher David Benatar sharpens the argument with unsettling precision. In Better Never to Have Been, he outlines the asymmetry at the heart of existence. The absence of suffering is always good, but the absence of pleasure is not bad if no one exists to miss it. In other words, if we choose not to bring someone into existence, we prevent their suffering, and no harm is done by depriving them of joys they never would have known. It is a disarmingly simple formula, one that circles us back to the echoes of Sophocles, to the teachings of the Buddha, to Schopenhauer's refusal to look away. All were circling the same unsettling realization. Life is always a gamble, but the house odds are fixed against us. Suffering is certain, and every birth guarantees another unwilling player at the table. Antinatalism asks something radical in its simplicity. What if the most merciful act is not to create life at all? What if the true compassion lies not in bringing someone into this world of heartbreak and decay, but in sparing them from it altogether? It is a question that unsettles because it strips away our deepest illusions. It forces us to ask whether love and joy, fragile, fleeting, always overshadowed, are truly enough to justify pain, despair, and mortality. And if not, then perhaps the silence of non-existence carries more mercy than the cry of birth. Closing meditation, the courage of non-creation. What if the decision not to create life is not an act of despair, but an act of love? We often imagine parenthood as the highest expression of care, the ultimate gift someone can give. But viewed through another lens, refusing to bring another being into the world can be understood as an even deeper form of compassion, the quiet choice to shield someone from suffering before it begins. Non-creation is not nothingness. It is protection. It is saying, I will not impose wounds that cannot be avoided, burdens that cannot be refused. It is a mercy so subtle that many fail to see it, for its gift is invisible. The child spared from existence cannot thank you, cannot recognize what they were saved from. And that is precisely the point. The greatest kindness often leaves no trace. This line of thought leads us into a paradox that lingers in the heart like an unresolvable chord. Perhaps the purest form of love is not to create at all, to embrace silence over the cry of birth, stillness over the storm of striving, nothingness over the inevitability of loss. And so we are left to consider, is it not possible, perhaps even noble, that the most compassionate legacy we could leave is not another life, but the gentle refusal to pass suffering forward? Sometimes love does not speak in the language of creation, but in the courage of renunciation. A love so invisible, so radical, that its only sign is silence.